The world remembers the Velvet Underground as rock's most dangerous experiment. But what they don't know is that behind those revolutionary sounds, a psychological war was raging. In 1966, when Andy Warhol forced a German ice goddess into Lou Reed's band, he didn't just add a vocalist. He lit a fuse that would explode into one of rock history's most toxic, sexually charged, and creatively destructive relationships. And Warhol watched it all unfold with the detached fascination of a scientist observing rats in a maze. But what happened at that factory party in 1967 would cross a line that even Warhol hadn't anticipated. The violence, the humiliation, the words that could never be taken back. This wasn't just artistic tension. This was war, dressed in black leather and European mystique, set to the soundtrack of feedback and heroin-fueled genius. Before we dive into the chaos that almost destroyed the Velvet Underground, subscribe to this channel for more untold stories from rock's darkest corners. Because what you're about to hear has been buried for decades, hidden behind legends and lies. Lou Reed didn't want Nico. He made that clear from the moment Andy Warhol introduced the statuesque German model to the band in late 1965. Reed had spent years crafting the Velvet Underground sound with John Cale, building something revolutionary from the ruins of conventional rock and roll. They were exploring sonic territories that made other bands uncomfortable, writing songs about heroin and sadomasochism when everyone else was singing about holding hands. The last thing Reed needed was some Warhol superstar diluting his vision with her untrained voice and her film star presence. But Warhol wasn't asking, he was telling. And when Andy Warhol told you something in 1966, if you wanted access to his world, his money, his revolutionary credibility, you listened. Warhol had been searching for the perfect combination of high art and street culture, and he saw in the Velvet Underground the raw material for his greatest living sculpture. Nico, with her Marlene Dietrich cheekbones and her damaged European glamour, was the missing piece. She was beautiful in a way that made people uncomfortable, cold in a way that suggested depths of experience that Americans couldn't comprehend. She had modeled for Vogue, acted in Fellini films, carried herself like fallen royalty wandering through the wreckage of post-war Europe. Reed saw through it immediately. To him, Nico represented everything he despised about the art world's obsession with surface over substance, beauty over truth. He had grown up in Brooklyn, endured electroshock therapy for his sexuality, clawed his way into the downtown music scene through sheer, stubborn genius. Nico had been handed everything on the basis of her face, her height, her accent. When she opened her mouth to sing, her voice was untrained, nearly monotone, lacking any of the technical skill Reed valued. She couldn't keep time properly. She didn't understand the experimental structures he and Cale were building. Worse, she didn't seem to care. But Warhol understood something Reed didn't, or perhaps something Reed refused to acknowledge. Nico's voice, precisely because it was untrained and strange, carried a kind of otherworldly quality that perfectly complemented the Velvet Underground's alien sound. When she sang Femme Fatale, or All Tomorrow's Parties, her flat, haunted delivery transformed Reed's lyrics into something even more unsettling than he had imagined. She sounded like she was singing from beyond the grave, or from some frozen European castle where emotion had been carefully excised. It was perfect. And Reed hated that it was perfect. The rehearsals at the factory became battlegrounds. Reed would deliberately start songs in keys that didn't suit Nico's limited range. He would change arrangements without telling her, leaving her confused and exposed on stage. He made sure she understood, without saying it directly, that she was not really part of the band. She was Warhol's imposition, a beautiful disruption that Reed tolerated only because he had no choice. The other band members, John Cale, Sterling Morrison, and Maureen Tucker, watched this Cold War with increasing discomfort. Cale, always more open to experimental collaboration, sometimes defended Nico's contributions. This only deepened Reed's resentment. Nico, for her part, refused to play the grateful ingenue. She had survived too much to be intimidated by a Brooklyn poet with an attitude problem. She had grown up in bombed-out Berlin, had been modeling since she was a teenager, had navigated the predatory world of European cinema and fashion. Lou Reed's passive-aggressive rehearsal tactics were nothing compared to what she had endured. She responded to his coldness with her own glacial indifference, showing up late to rehearsals, forgetting lyrics, sometimes disappearing entirely for days. When Reed criticized her, she would stare at him with those enormous eyes and say nothing, or respond in her heavily accented English with observations so cutting that the rest of the band would wince. But underneath the professional animosity, something else was happening, something neither Reed nor Nico wanted to acknowledge. There was an attraction, complicated and toxic, built on mutual recognition of damage in the other. Reed, who had been declared sick by his own family and subjected to psychiatric torture, saw in Nico someone who had also been treated as an object, used and discarded by the people who claimed to admire her. Nico, who had built walls of ice around herself as protection, recognized in Reed's angry defensiveness a kindred spirit, someone else who had learned that vulnerability was dangerous. The factory, with its silver walls and its anything-goes atmosphere, became the stage for their complicated dance. Warhol's space was designed to dissolve boundaries, to make people reveal themselves in ways they normally wouldn't. Amphetamines circulated freely. So did rumors, gossip, sexual experimentation. The superstars who orbited Warhol, people like Ondine and Bridget Berlin and Edie Sedgwick, treated confession like performance art. In that environment, the line between artistic collaboration and sexual tension became impossible to locate. There were nights when Reed and Nico would end up talking in corners of the factory, long conversations that the others couldn't quite hear, where Reed's usual armor would crack just slightly and Nico's ice would melt into something almost human. There were moments during performances where their voices would intertwine in ways that suggested intimacy rather than animosity. John Cale later remembered watching them on stage and thinking that they looked like two people who desperately wanted to destroy each other and desperately wanted to possess each other, sometimes in the same moment. But neither could surrender to the attraction without losing the power struggle. Reed couldn't allow himself to want Nico, because wanting her would mean admitting that Warhol had been right to force her into the band. It would mean acknowledging that she had value beyond her appearance, that her presence enhanced rather than diminished his music. For Nico, allowing herself to want Reed would mean making herself vulnerable to someone who had made his contempt for her crystal clear, who saw her as an impediment rather than a collaborator. So instead of acknowledging the attraction, they channeled it into cruelty. The cruelty took different forms. Reed would write songs and refuse to let Nico sing them, giving her only the numbers he considered less important, the throwaways. He would mock her accent in front of the band, imitating her flat delivery in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. He made sure she understood that when critics praised the Velvet Underground, they were praising his vision, not her contribution. Nico's revenge was more subtle but equally devastating. She would show up to performances looking so stunning that the audience couldn't take their eyes off her, rendering Reed's performance secondary. She would give interviews to European magazines where she would talk about the band as if it were her project, as if Reed and the others were simply her backing musicians. She knew exactly how to wound his ego, and through it all, Andy Warhol watched. Because this was exactly what he wanted. Warhol understood better than anyone that tension creates art, that the most interesting creative situations come from putting incompatible elements together and seeing what happens. He had built his entire factory ecosystem on this principle. The rich and the poor, the educated and the street smart, the beautiful and the damaged, all thrown together in a silver-walled pressure cooker where anything could happen. Warhol deliberately played Reed and Nico against each other. He would praise Nico to Reed, talking about her European sophistication, her film career, her natural star quality. Then he would turn around and tell Nico that Reed was a genius, that she was lucky to be working with someone of his caliber, that she should be grateful for the opportunity. He set up photo shoots where Nico was front and center, knowing it would infuriate Reed. He gave interviews where he positioned Nico as the face of the Velvet Underground, the visual element that made the band comprehensible to the art world. But Warhol also made sure Reed knew he was indispensable, that the songs were what mattered, that Nico was ultimately replaceable. It was a delicate balancing act, keeping both egos inflated enough to continue working together, while preventing either from feeling secure enough to relax. Warhol treated human relationships like his artwork, as things to be manipulated and observed rather than experienced. He was creating a living installation, and Reed and Nico were his materials. The other factory regulars picked up on the dynamic and amplified it. Gerard Malanga would whisper to Nico about Reed's insecurities, things he had said in private moments. Paul Morrissey would tell Reed stories about Nico's romantic entanglements, about the famous men she had been with, about her reputation. The whole factory became invested in the psychodrama, taking sides, placing bets on when the situation would finally explode. And then came the party. It was April 1967, and the Velvet Underground had just returned from a brief California tour that had been a disaster in multiple ways. The band had been poorly received in Los Angeles, where the hippie scene found their music too dark, too aggressive, too real. Reed and Nico had barely spoken during the entire trip, their Cold War having escalated to the point where they communicated only through other band members. The California sun and optimism had felt like an insult to everything they represented. Back at the factory, Warhol threw one of his legendary parties to welcome them home. The silver-walled space was packed with the usual cast of superstars, hangers-on, artists, and beautiful damaged people looking for something they couldn't quite name. Amphetamines and alcohol flowed freely. The Velvet Underground's first album was playing on the sound system, that banana-covered LP that was starting to gain cult recognition in the underground. Reed arrived already in a foul mood, having spent the day arguing with his family about his career choices, about the music he was making, about his life. His parents still didn't understand, still saw his artistic ambitions as further evidence of the sickness they had tried to cure with electroshock years earlier. He walked into the factory looking for a fight, and the first person he saw was Nico, holding court in the center of the room, surrounded by admirers, looking like a blonde glacier in a black dress. She was talking to a young filmmaker, someone new to the factory scene, and she was describing her vision for the Velvet Underground, how she wanted to take the band in a more European direction, more theatrical, more visually sophisticated. Reed heard this and felt something snap inside him. It was one thing for her to be dismissive of his music in private, another thing entirely to reinvent the band's history in front of strangers, to position herself as the creative force. He walked over and interrupted the conversation, his voice cutting through the factory noise. What happened next depends on who's telling the story. Some people who were there remember Reed saying something, cutting about Nico's musical abilities, something about how she couldn't carry a tune if it had handles. Others remember him being more personally cruel, making a comment about her past, about the men she had been with, about her son Christian, whose father she refused to name publicly. Nico's response was ice-cold and devastating. She turned to Reed with those enormous eyes and said, in her flat German accent, something that silenced the entire room. The exact words have been disputed for decades. Some claim she said that Reed was a mediocre songwriter, trying to hide behind noise and shock value. Others remember her saying something more personal, something about his sexuality, about the electroshock therapy, about the fear that drove his need to control everything around him. What everyone agrees on is what happened next. Reed, his face flushed with rage and possibly amphetamines, picked up a glass from a nearby table and threw it. Most accounts say he threw it at the wall near Nico, not at her directly, but the gesture was violent enough that the room went silent. Glass shattered against Warhol's silver walls. For a moment, everyone froze, waiting to see what would happen next. Nico didn't flinch. She stood perfectly still, looking at Reed with an expression that was neither afraid nor angry, just coldly observational, as if she were watching an interesting experiment. Then she turned back to the filmmaker she had been talking to and continued her conversation as if nothing had happened. The dismissal was absolute. It said more clearly than words that Reed's violence, his rage, his need to dominate, meant nothing to her. She had survived worse. He was just another damaged man throwing a tantrum. Reed left the party immediately, pushing through the crowd and disappearing into the New York night. Warhol, who had watched the entire scene unfold without intervening, simply smiled his enigmatic smile and continued filming. For him, this was perfect. This was exactly the kind of authentic human drama that couldn't be staged or manufactured. This was real. In the weeks following the factory incident, the situation became untenable. Reed refused to be in the same room with Nico for rehearsals. He stopped writing songs for her to sing. He made it clear to Warhol and to the rest of the band that a choice had to be made, that he could no longer function in a situation where Nico was present. The other band members, torn between loyalty to Reed and recognition of what Nico brought to the performances, mostly sided with Reed. He was, after all, the primary songwriter. The band existed because of his vision. Nico, sensing the shift in power dynamics, began to distance herself from the Velvet Underground. She started pursuing solo work, encouraged by some of the factory crowd who saw an opportunity to manage her independently. She recorded her first solo album, Chelsea Girl, with help from some of the Velvet Underground members, but without Reed's involvement. The album showcased her voice in a different context, supported by more conventional arrangements that let her limited range work to atmospheric effect. By the time the Velvet Underground recorded their second album, White Light, White Heat, in late 1967, Nico was gone. Reed had gotten what he wanted. The band was purely his vision again, no longer diluted by Warhol's aesthetic impositions. White Light, White Heat was aggressive, abrasive, uncompromising in ways that the first album, with its Nico-fronted songs, had not been. It was Reed's statement of independence, both from Warhol and from Nico. But the cost of that independence became clear over the years. The Velvet Underground never achieved the commercial success Reed craved. The first album, with Nico's haunting presence on songs like Femme Fatale and All Tomorrow's Parties, became the one that casual fans remembered, the one that defined the band for people who didn't dig deeper into the catalog. Nico's image, her blonde hair against the banana on Warhol's album cover, became the visual representation of the Velvet Underground in the public imagination. Reed had won the battle but lost the war for how the band would be remembered. The relationship between Reed and Nico never recovered. Over the decades that followed, they moved in different circles, pursued different musical paths, but the ghost of their toxic collaboration haunted both of them. Nico's solo career took her deeper into avant-garde territory, her voice growing even more sepulchral as she aged, her songs becoming darker meditations on death and isolation. She became a cult figure in Europe, performing in small clubs, always carrying with her the mystique of the factory years. Reed, after the Velvet Underground dissolved, finally achieved the commercial success he had always wanted with his solo career. Transformer, produced by David Bowie in 1972, gave him the hit single Walk on the Wild Side and made him a star. He became one of rock's elder statesmen, his influence growing as younger bands discovered the Velvet Underground's albums and recognized them as foundational texts. But in interviews, when asked about Nico, Reed's responses were always complicated, mixing resentment with something that might have been regret. He would acknowledge her contribution to the first album while maintaining that her presence had been imposed on the band, that it wasn't his choice. He would admit that her voice had a certain quality while insisting that she wasn't really a musician. He could never quite let go of the need to diminish her, even decades later, even after both their careers had moved in such different directions that there was no longer any competition between them. Nico was more generous in her reflections, or perhaps just more honest. She told interviewers that Reed was a brilliant songwriter and a deeply damaged person, that the two things were inseparable. She said that their conflict had been inevitable, that they were both too hurt by their pasts to allow themselves the vulnerability that collaboration requires. She suggested that in another time, another context, without Warhol's manipulations and the factory's toxic atmosphere, they might have created something even more revolutionary together. When Nico died in 1988, falling from a bicycle on the Spanish island of Ibiza, Reed's response was telling. He didn't release a public statement. He didn't attend any memorial services. But friends reported that he seemed shaken by the news, that for weeks afterward he was unusually subdued. He was working on his New York album at the time, a collection of songs about the city that had shaped both of them, and some people close to him believed that Nico's death influenced the darkness of those songs, the sense of loss that permeated the record. Looking back now, with the perspective of decades, what becomes clear is that the real villain of the Nico and Lou Reed story was never either of them. It was Warhol, with his cool detachment and his willingness to treat human beings as artistic materials. Warhol created a situation where two damaged, brilliant people were forced into collaboration and conflict, where their personal demons were amplified for the entertainment of the factory crowd, where genuine creative potential was sacrificed to the god of interesting drama. Warhol believed that art required tension, that comfort was the enemy of creativity. He was probably right about that, at least to some degree. But what he failed to account for, or perhaps didn't care about, was the human cost of that philosophy. Reed and Nico were both survivors of significant trauma before they ever met. Reed had been tortured by psychiatrists at his family's request. Nico had survived the bombing of Berlin, had been exploited by the fashion and film industries from a young age. They needed healing, support, understanding. Instead, Warhol put them in a pressure cooker and watched what happened. The music they created together, particularly on that first Velvet Underground album, was extraordinary precisely because of the tension between them. Nico's cold, detached vocals on All Tomorrow's Parties created a perfect counterpoint to Reed's more emotional, aggressive performances. The beauty and the danger, the ice and the fire, worked together in ways that neither could have achieved alone. But the price of that artistic achievement was paid in psychological damage, in wounds that never fully healed. Today, The Velvet Underground and Nico is recognized as one of the most influential albums in rock history. Musicians from David Bowie to Patti Smith to countless punk and alternative bands have cited it as foundational. The combination of Reed's transgressive lyrics, the band's experimental sound, and Nico's haunting presence created something that had never existed before and has never been quite replicated since. But we should also remember that album as evidence of what happens when artistic ambition overrides human compassion, when the drive to create something revolutionary causes us to treat people as expendable. Reed and Nico were both geniuses in their own ways, both artists who deserved better than to be pieces in Warhol's game. The fact that they created beauty out of their conflict doesn't redeem the conflict itself. The story of Nico and Lou Reed is ultimately a tragedy disguised as a triumph. Yes, they made groundbreaking music. Yes, they influenced generations of artists who came after them. But they also destroyed something that might have been even more extraordinary if it had been allowed to develop in an environment of mutual respect rather than manufactured antagonism. We got one great album and decades of bitterness. We got art, but at the cost of the artists themselves. And perhaps that's the real lesson of the factory years, of Warhol's whole project. The silver walls reflected everything back at twice the intensity, but they didn't create anything new. They just took what was already there, the beauty and the damage, and amplified it until something broke. In the case of Nico and Lou Reed, what broke was the possibility of collaboration, of two wounded people helping each other create rather than destroying each other in the name of art. The violence at that 1967 factory party, the thrown glass and the cold stares, was just the visible symptom of a deeper violence. The violence of treating human beings as materials for a performance. The violence of creating situations where people's worst instincts are encouraged rather than tempered. Warhol got his drama, his authentic moment of conflict caught on film and embedded in factory legend. But Reed and Nico paid the price, in anger and resentment that lasted the rest of their lives.